So we'll thank Dr. Victor Darley-Esmar for joining us today for what should be a really helpful and interesting presentation. Dr. Darley-Esmar, probably all of you know, is professor in the Department of Pathology, cellular pathology portion. Your title in the department changes regularly. So
yeah, I'm vice chair at the moment, right?
And
all the vice, I think.
Right. He's had a really interesting career path. He's got his PhD in England at the University of Essex and had postdoctoral training at various times. At least once has spent some time in industry and has a very good perspective on the difference between the scientific enterprise and industry and in university settings. He's been kind to share that experience with us in the CTS training program, which I encourage if you have a chance to hear about that in the future, that you take advantage of it. He's been of course, has led a very active research program. His own research program is very, very successful. He is an author. He has an H factor of 90, which means that he has 90 papers that have been cited 90 times or more, which is a very high level of recognition by his peers. But relevant to today, he's been the editor of a journal. He's reviewed over 1,500 papers. He's has had to learn how to handle this challenge of reviewing a paper quickly. Now, I don't know how much he's going to approach it today from the perspective of reviewing a paper as a service to the community, as you do when you're helping a journal decide which papers it's going to pick, or in terms of how you review a paper in terms of the value of its data to your own research program. Both of those are obviously really important, and I'm sure what he says will both. So he's always been really happy to have people interrupt and ask questions or share your own experiences as we go. That's particularly true. I know there are people who have joined us online, so Dr. Darley-Esmar will be tolerant of you.
I encourage it, indeed.
If there's too much background noise, we may have to mute the people online, and we will certainly unmute you at the end of the presentation so there can be discussion. So thanks very much for that.
Yeah, thank you. So although I'm going to talk to you about how to review a paper in, on average, less than an hour, it took me about 5 days to write this talk. So you start off with these things and then you think, oh God, how am I going to do this? And it's I'm going to share with you some of the perspectives from both an editor and a reviewer. And this is about trying to make your life a bit more efficient. Now, there's this notion that, this is quite a funny picture, I think. There's the paper accepted here, and then there's these people with running the gauntlet, and you've got to do this. And there is this notion that getting your paper published is you have to run a gauntlet. And that notion, of course, is perpetuated by the behavior of reviewers. And I'm going to put to you that that's extremely time-consuming and not very helpful to the community. Now, we're going to do this if I can work out how to advance the slides. Oh. Right, it doesn't.
See if we're. Sorry.
So first thing is that when you come and give a talk, figure out how the controls work, right? How do you advance the slides then? So who are you reviewing for? Let's have some suggestions. Who are you reviewing for?
Medicine.
No. No. I'm talking about people, right? Who are you reviewing for people? The journal. What else? The readers. What else? The authors. What else? Community. Yeah. What else? Yourself. Right? Right. Okay, so the editors. Your primary role is to review your customer, and your deliverables are to the person who is the editor, because that's the person who has to take action on what you generate. The authors is part of our process of improving and working on our science, the scientific community. Yourself, it's a learning exercise. You can learn a lot from the process of reviewing. It makes you understand the literature. It gives you an insight, a privileged insight into the way people are thinking, and it puts you on the cutting edge because you're going to see things which are going to be appearing in the next 3 to 6 months. Promotion and tenure. Sorry? Well, sometimes or not. Yeah. So promotion and tenure is part of being your service to the community, right? Makes your papers better. If you read somebody else's paper and you say, wow, I can't understand what they're saying at all, it makes you write better. It's a collegiality. If you publish, you should be prepared to review. It's only fair, right? If you write grants, then you should be prepared to review grants. If you get students, you should be prepared to teach. So unless we all participate in these things, then it won't work. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what the process is, and then you can see more clearly what it is that you are being asked to do and how you want to do it. So it starts with submitting a paper. Everybody here submitted a paper, right? So you've all done that. So you've all had direct experience on that. So it goes to the editor. And the editor looks at it, a person like me, and says, are the basic requirements there? If not, it's immediately rejected. Okay, so we'll talk about what causes an immediate reject. So what causes that? And why do we do it? We do it because the system is very overloaded with materials and papers, right? And if things are not meeting the minimum requirements, and so on, then, and I'll talk about what those are, then, you're wasting people's time. And you don't want to do that. Your reviewers are valuable. Trust me, it's very hard to get people to review a paper well and effectively. So what happens? Submission of papers which are clearly not in the scope of the journal. So if you're doing a paper on cell biology, and the journal is talking about medicinal chemistry, then it's going to be out of scope. Now that's and it's just going to get rejected, and so you just wasted your time, right? That sounds extreme, but you'd be surprised. If you're not sure, ask the editor, all right? If you don't format the paper according to the guide for authors, or you miss sections, so if you're doing a research paper and there are no methods, it's going to get rejected. If you are doing a review paper and there are no figures, it's going to get rejected. No statistics. If there's no statistics, it's not reviewable. Illegible figures, it's not reviewable. No figure legends, it's not reviewable. No English, it's not reviewable. And then if I look at any of these and any one of these is a yes, I reject it. And I tell them why, and they have an opportunity to come back and fix this. But then it shouldn't get to any of you. And if it does get to you, you can reject it on the same basis. So it passes the first filter, and so then you assign reviewers.
You said 70% of what it says about 70% will be rejected. Said about this stage or the total rejection?
The total rejection, the overall rejections are about, in a journal which has an impact, for a journal to have an impact factor of 5 or more, it has to be rejecting 70 to 80% of the papers. If you're in these high-flying journals like Nature and what have you, it's rejecting 95% of the papers, and they have a different process. I'm not going to talk about that. I can tell you about it if you're interested, but it's a different process. So about 30%, if the editors are good and conscientious, about 30% of the papers are editorial rejects, desk rejects. And typically they're from people who are not experienced in sending papers. They might be from they've not been read or something. So the reasons are really obvious. None of you would want to review those papers. If you're in doubt, the notion is that you send give the authors a chance, right? So if you're on the borderline, give them a chance, you know. So then you assign viewers, and then what will happen now, let's switch to being the reviewer. You're going to get an invitation letter, and you don't gloss over the invitation letter, read it, because there's important information. Read the title, that gives you the topic. You need to look at who the authors are, because that determines whether you have a conflict of interest. And you need to look at how long they're going to give you to review it. So if that is 10 days, then, well, we'll talk about what that is. So then you have a choice to accept or decline. In this case, since this is my wife, I had to accept it. But normally you have a choice about whether you accept or decline the paper. If you decline the paper and it's somebody you know, one of your colleagues, it's collegial to give them a reason, right? So this is the 2-minute decision. I promise you, you can do it on average under an hour. 2 minutes. Conflict of interest. Same institution is not allowed. So if that's a mistake, it can happen, because it's, you know, often there are multiple authors and there are multiple institutions and there are multiple places. So it might be the editor of the journal overlooks it, right? So that is possible, but you can't be reviewing papers from your same institution. That's just absolutely not allowed. So just send it back, say, sorry, you must have made a mistake. I once got a paper to review, was in fact my own paper. And I sent it back and I said, this is fantastic, publish it. Right? If it's a collaborator, then, you know, you have to use a bit of judgment about that. So if it's a collaborator, you should then tell the editor and say, I am a collaborator of this person, but I am confident I can give a fair review. Or alternatively, I'm a collaborator and I don't feel comfortable. Either one is totally fine, right? And you will find that why is because our community is quite small. And so if everybody recused themselves on some basis of some relationship or some collaboration or something that you were on some paper 5 years ago, nobody would review anything because we'd all be conflicted. Previous trainee. If it's an immediate previous trainee, the last 4 or 5 years, don't do it. It's conflicted. If it's the last 10 years or something, you should then declare it, right? Declare it first to the editor and say, by the way, this person was my previous postdoc, but since then has worked independently. I'm comfortable doing it, or I'm not comfortable doing it. So it's about declaring your, if you have a conflict, then you must declare it. And then the editor has the choice of whether they want to proceed. I've done that many, many times. And I'll tell you, every single time I was asked to review the paper. So, you know, it's very unlikely that they will exclude it. You shouldn't review it if you don't know anything about it, because guarantee you that will take you 10 hours to review it. So if you know nothing about the topic, don't take the attitude, oh, this is a good chance for me to learn, because that's not fair to the authors and it's going to take you a massive amount of time, right? So you've got to be honest about what you know and what you don't know. You know too much. Sometimes you can get a paper which is practically the title of paper you're working on and want to submit. Tempting though it is, decline that, because that's not fair. You can't be objective, right? Too much is a close competition, especially if it's somebody which you're actually arguing with. The authors can actually exclude people. I, as a general principle, never ever do that. But you've got to also be collegial about it. If you really think that you don't agree and you've had conflicts with a person in a meeting and you've never agreed with anything they say, well, really, you're not the person to review it. Let somebody else do that. You have 5 other papers to review already where you're clearly overcommitted and you're not going to be able to do it, right? Don't overcommit yourself. You're writing a grant. You will not progress your career significantly by reviewing a paper, right? You have to do a few and you have to do some to be collegial, as I said, but it's not going to make you change your career. So if you're doing a grant, that's the priority. If you're going on holiday, for God's sake, don't go down to the beach and be reviewing somebody else's paper, okay? Give yourself a break. Yeah. You can say no. I mean, every journal gives some ludicrous time, like give it me tomorrow, right? But you can say, look, I'm sorry, I've got commitments, I'm going to be out of town, but I can do it in 3 weeks. But then if you do say that, you've got to deliver, okay? Because 9 times out of 10, the editor will say, yes, that's okay, right? So typically there's a decline box. You can recommend one of your other friends or not your friends, depending on how you feel about it, to review, right? When you get that notice in the email, respond immediately, within an hour, right? So the editor can move on. Nobody's going to bother. What is really frustrating, and every morning I look at my editors list and I see invited, not response, right? Why? Why? Why did you say, no, thank you? Just do it. It's collegial, right? So you agree. What does the journal want? Now, this is very important. You can't review every paper in the same way. So PLOS ONE just says the study presents the results of primary scientific research, and it should not have been published anywhere else. Doesn't care about impact, doesn't care about anything except for the fact of it's novel and hasn't been published anywhere else. Now, that can mean doing an experiment in one cell type that's been done and then doing it in another cell type. You have to choose a judgment whether that's significantly different or not. Nature Cell Biology, structural, striking, conceptual advance and an in-depth understanding of the processes under study. Well, that means you're practically on the verge of getting a Nobel Prize. So, you know, if you do, if you send there, you better have some notion about what is expected. And also, if you're reviewing for them, there will be 5 or 6 reviewers. You will not be expected to review the whole paper. They will expect you to review part of it. So even if it's Nature Cell Biology, you're not expected to review the whole thing. And you're not expected to write more than you would write normally. Cell, a little bit, you know, little bit different, right? Slightly lower. JBC is a bit pretentious, I think, and it would like to have some of the cachet of Nature, but it doesn't quite do it. So the editors then have a lot more discretion about what they think is novel and important, right? So you have to understand who you're reviewing for. So if you're reviewing for PLOS, then it's no point in talking about novelty and impact. If you're reviewing for Nature and Cell Biology, you'll be specifically asked to do it. So the journal policy, right? This is, you'll see something here. You may know that because you have some familiarity and it's quite often you've reviewed for people before, but you may not, right? So here it says the conclusions are inappropriate and are supported by the data. The article is intelligent and written in standard English and it meets the ethical requirements. This is basically the absolute minimum, right? Don't review for journals with an impact factor lower than 4 to 5. It's a waste of your time, really. You're not going to see the best papers. You're not going to advance the field. You're not going to learn much, and you're just using a lot of your energy for relatively little impact. There is an exception to that. There are some fields where, for example, an impact factor of 2 is a fantastic paper. So you've got to understand your own field. But I'm talking in life sciences, anything lower than 4 isn't really considered a high impact journal. There are some exceptions, like, for example, American Journal of Physiology. Typically, physiology, a really good paper in physiology has an impact factor of around 3. A really good paper in cell biology, biochemistry has an impact factor around 6. So there's a difference in field. And I have quite a lot of papers in AGP, but it's because there's a different field. But don't spend your time working on things for journals which are not going to push the edge. That is a different thing if you have a relationship with either the editors of the journal itself. I started a journal with no impact factor. So then I had to beg people to review it, right? Take a quick look. And you should be in the mode of rejecting, right? So you should be, how can I reject this paper? Because that's what the journal wants you to do. They want you to reject 80%. So if any of these things are true, you don't have to read the paper. No statistics, you don't have to read it. You just say, I'm sorry, I can't evaluate this. There's no statistical evaluation. You're done, right? You can't see the figures, you can't see the figures. Now, in that case, you can go back to the editor and say, can you get me better quality figures because I can't see these? And well, there's reasons why this happens, actually. It's not usually the authors. Well, the way the upload systems work, sometimes they restrict the file size, right? But it's still the author's problem because they should have checked what you were going to see. Everybody can check what you submitted, right? And if you can't see the figures, they should have done it again. So you don't have to review. I would not review it because you can't, actually. If you can't understand the English, your job is not to fix the English. There are companies that do that, and they should do it. If you can't understand the English, you can't review it. If it's got like 2 figures and the typical, and it's not a short communication journal, the editor should have rejected it. But you can reject it and saying, this is not a sufficient body of work, right? And more needs to be done. So that's a 2-minute decision. And that should only be happening if the editor hasn't filtered hard enough, right? So the 15-minute decision, that's when you use PubMed a bit. So you put the title as it is into PubMed. So does it show up there? Then you take a couple of keywords and does it show up a topic with the same result? So this is one of my papers that was published in 1994. So this is the title. So if you do a search on cytochrome oxidase and nitric oxide, then you get one, at that time, if you look backwards from 1994 when it was submitted, you get one paper. And if you can, but just by looking at the title, you can look at the abstract, it's got no connection. So this is never been done before. So you're good, right? If you'd have done the same thing in September 1994, 2 months after we published it, then you would find 3 papers now, all quite similar, right? But there's something different. One is in astrocytes, the other's in synaptosomes, and it's got a different mechanism. Here it says it's reversible, here it says reversible here, and here is in astrocytes. So these all happened at the same time. The paper, this paper, my paper, would have had a hard time if these papers had already existed. So I would then have to have a look and say, what is it that really saying that's different? Right? Now, this also tells you it's very important to publish your work promptly and quickly as soon as you get it, because this paper, my paper, was cited over 1,000 times. And if I had have procrastinated and not submitted, I probably wouldn't have even got it published. So it's quite possible that in the world as it stands, there are other people working on what you're working on. And being a prompt reviewer is then part of that. But that's being a fair thing. It would have been easy for any of these people, wouldn't it, to block what we were doing because it competed very closely with what they were doing. But they didn't do, well, I don't know who reviewed it, frankly, but that didn't happen. If you do it 22 years later, like now, there's 3,579. So that tells you you've moved from a field which there was nothing happening to a field where now there's thousands of papers, right? That means you have got to really know a little bit about that field to make a judgment about what it's saying that's new, right? And that's a bit more of a challenge. And you have to have some expertise in order to do that. So you can narrow the search, you can use the authors, you can look up the authors, because if they've published something which is very similar, you can say it's incremental, it doesn't advance things. So that's a little bit, then if you're at this sort of scenario, you've got to dig deeper. You can't reject it now because you've got to understand a bit more about what the paper's about. A lot of journals, plus one is one, well, most is true, when you do the actual review, there is in fact a built-in form. So they try to make it easier for you. You don't have to write a lot of stuff. And so you should have a look, right, at what they have. And then these require yes-no answers. Is the manuscript technically sound and the data support the conclusions? Select a response. Yes, no. Okay? And so part of the things that you are supposed to be doing becoming, so make sure you know what that is. Don't start reviewing the paper in absence of knowing what you're supposed to do. Okay? Don't start doing it and writing it and then transfer it, all right? So if it's novel, then we're in the major revision reject. So you've got three choices: minor revision, major revision, or reject. So if it's novel and there's some replication and statistics missing, it doesn't use the state-of-the-art techniques, then you should ask for confirmation of alternatives. There's misinterpretations. It depends how big that's an issue. You can say modify the interpretation or change it. Unclear explanations or descriptions. Lack of context, so they don't talk about what was done before and why. So each paper at the beginning should say, we know this, we have shown this, this paper is about this. And if it doesn't say those things, then you're going to say the context and review of the literature is not adequate. You don't have to explain why it's not adequate particularly. Right? If it occurs to you as you're doing it, you can write that. Missing controls, got to do it. Consider other interpretations, got to do it. Title is not connected to the study. I mean, there are many, at the moment it's the era of both politically and scientifically of exaggerating our claims. You know, I will make cancer go away. And it turns out to be a cell culture study with MAP kinases, right? I will cure cancer. So there is a lot of exaggeration and disconnect between what is in the paper and what the title is. And it's your job to point that out. All of these things, as any one or two or three of these things is a major minor revision issue. If every single one is hitting up, you got to think a bit, it's probably a reject. Okay, so you have a level of judgment here, right, that you have to exercise. So a major revision. The manuscript is interesting and novel. There are significant deficiencies, must be corrected before acceptance. But those deficiencies might be a lack of a control, a lack of a method that would show something clear, right? There could be things missed out. There could be text modifications. There could be some additional experiments. All of those things are major revisions. So anything that requires an experiment is a major revision. Anything that doesn't require an experiment is a minor revision. So if it is more than 6 months' work, then unless you're reviewing for a very, high-powered journal, but if you're in, like Nature, Cell, then typically it's a year or two to get published. But the average sort of journal, like Impact Factor around 6, they're expecting a 3-month turnaround, right? So if you're proposing 6 months of work, you should reject it because that's not what the journal is looking for, right? Minor revision. Still, it's got to be interesting and novel. Some elements need to be clarified, restructured, shortened, or expanded, not often. And minor revision, of course, doesn't mean it's accepted. So you could have something which, they used the wrong statistical analysis. So you could have a thing where they used a student t-test to look just at 2 groups changing, but in fact the experimental design has 4 groups. So it wasn't the right method. But when you look at the data, it's pretty obvious that things are different anyway. So it's pretty likely, even if they use a 2A and over, then it's going to be fine. So that is a minor revision, right? If you don't have any statistics at all, then, as I say, you should reject it because you can't make a judgment one way or the other, right? So this is this thing between major and minor revision. And partly it's a little bit of a cumulative thing. Now, I have to say there are very few circumstances where there is only a minor revision in the first submission. So that's pretty typical to ask for a major. And when you do the review, as you're reading the thing, have a title of major revision and minor revision. And as you're coming through, put those points numbered into either category. And then at the end you can reorder them or change from minor to major if you feel like it. But what it means is you don't have to read the thing. You must at all costs avoid reading the paper twice. So you get the paper, you pull it apart. You don't staple it. You pull it all into pieces. And you have the figures, the figure legends underneath them, and the text over here. So, and you have it all spread out. So you're not moving backwards and forwards in the text. I really don't understand why. The only reason we have papers formatted where all the figures at the end is that in the ancient days when I was first submitting papers, when they were chipped onto stone, right, it was very difficult to actually then put the figures into the text because there wasn't a word processing program to do it. So now, if you are making your paper, I would embed your figures in it because it makes life a lot easier. And many journals, all the Elsevier journals, you can publish in any format you want, right? But most journals are still doing them all separate. So you rip it all up and put it out on the thing, right? And check the figure legend matches the figure, because I guarantee you that will, in 50% of the times, people have misnumbered the figures or misnumbered the panels, right? So, can you do it in an hour? So, if you do what I say, you pull your paper apart, you write your report as you read the paper, because you're going to edit it afterwards. Write it on a separate document from the website of the paper. Do not fill it in on the form, on the paper at the time. Because if it crashes, which happens, or if you press the wrong button, or if their editing software doesn't allow a save halfway through, you've lost all your work. Right? So have it on a separate document, and then you're going to paste it in. Right. So sometimes I get papers where reviewers have written almost as much a complete abstract as a description of the paper. I have an abstract. I don't need you to write one, right? So you write 3 sentences. You say, this is an interesting, now, this is a paper you like, right? This is an interesting article addressing the topical area of this and this. The data is novel. The manuscript is clear and well written. The following points should be addressed. Now, you can write all the opposite things, right? This is an article which addresses the area of nitric oxide and mitochondria. Unfortunately, it provides only incremental advance over the current literature. The data is novel in part, the manuscript is not clear, and there are problems with its presentation. The following points should be addressed, right? So, but all you need to write is 2-3 sentences here. The authors know what their paper's about. The editor has the abstract anyway, and they don't need to read it. So a lot of people waste a hell of a lot of time describing the paper. You don't need to do that. Nobody's interested. Major points. If it needs an experiment, and you number them, the data shown in figure 1 appears to be missing the vehicle control. And always use the phrasing appears to be. Because it's possible you missed it, they didn't show it, it's in another place, they mentioned it in the methods and you glossed over it. So, don't be too righteous about it. Yeah. The hypothesis that nitric oxide controls mitochondria should be tested using the row 0 cells which lack mitochondria. So you may think you have a killer experiment which would do it. And if that experiment can be done in 3 months, why not, right? Minor points. Peroxynitrite is not free radical. This is an incorrect statement. So it's got to be corrected. But, the world will not end because that statement's made, right? Figure legends are mixed up. Very common. Happens, right? The following papers should be cited and discussed. They're missing the things like that. Avoid the temptation to include your own papers in that. All right? It's a little bit of a giveaway to the, an anonymity of the peer review system if you say, please cite my paper. I sometimes say, please cite Bruce Freeman's paper to see what will happen. But, I mean, don't, don't cite your own paper. Don't ask for your own papers to be cited. The conditions for the experiment in Figure 1 should be shown in more detail. All of those are writing things. If you sat down and you did it, it would take you an hour maximum. So they can't be major points, right? There are cases where, for example, some authors might ignore a complete area of a field. This paper has already been done. There is already this, then it can become a major point. But if it's along these lines, it's all minor. Why will it take you longer than an hour? There's always a reason. It shouldn't take you longer than an hour. You're looking, and when you start doing this, you start with the data. Don't read the introduction, doesn't matter. Don't read the materials and methods, doesn't matter. Start with the data and the figures, because if the data and the figures don't match what the statements they're making, you can make a decision. The better the paper is, the more of it you've got to read, right? So then once you've done the results and the figures, then you sort of got to say, okay, what did they say about it? Then you look at that. When they've said about it, then you look last at the introduction. Did they set this up? Because you can't judge the introduction until you've seen the rest of the paper, because you've got to understand what it is they're trying to say, right? And then you could say whether, and then your introduction should be either no comment at all, or expand this point or make point why you're doing this. For example, it's very common for people to use one cell type to test an idea. For example, they might have an introduction that says that sodium channel dysfunction is important in kidney disease, and then do the experiment on the lung epithelial cell. All right, that's pretty common, that sort of thing. You have to ask the question, there might be a good reason for that. For example, it might be the lung epithelial cell is the cell in which the sodium channel was transfected, and so it's the model in which to do it. And it might just require an explanation, right? Or it might be totally illogical, right? So, you've got to find that. So you're out of your depth. You get into it and you suddenly discover, in fact, you don't get it. You don't understand it. It's really complicated. And this happened to me the other day. I just had no clue what this paper was actually about, even though from the title I should have done, right? So comment on what you can, and then there is always a place that you can contact the editor in confidence and tell them, I'm sorry, I did not understand these parts. This is not my area or expertise. I've only commented on this. You need to get somebody else to do that. For example, maybe a clinical study, and I might be asked to look at it because they use some biochemical measurement. I have expertise, but I have no clue how a clinical trial works. So I would say, I've commented on these techniques and this thing, but I don't understand about clinical trials and that statistics, so you need somebody else. And editors are very used to using different people for different reasons, right? You're suggesting the study you would do instead of reviewing the one the authors submitted. This is the most common reason why people spend too long. It's because they take the position they're actually doing a lab meeting, right? And you're restructuring the person's experiments, right? Not your job, right? And a waste of time, and not the forum in which to do that. There are other forums in which that's permissible and appropriate. But you shouldn't be writing that it would have been better if the authors had done this experiment, right? That's not your business, right? You have to judge what's in front of you. And if you start down that path, you're going to spend a lot of time. All you've got to do is say, or you're only asking one question, do the authors provide an internally consistent story which fits the data? That's all you're asking. You're not being asked to find another story that fits the data. You are writing more than one page. Why? If you're writing more than one page, you should reject it because there's too much stuff that's wrong with it. So do not try to fix the paper. You're not being asked to fix the paper. You are being asked to make a decision of your opinion of the paper, and you have to provide enough information to actually validate that thing. You don't have to fix it, right? If you have more than 6 comments, then you should probably reject. So the only reason you would write more is as you were going through it in that process I described, you're making notes, and you've made the notes, so you might as well share them with the authors for their benefit. But your job is not to go and fix the paper. That's not what you're being asked to do.
So I almost feel like though you're walking a tightrope between, I mean, I get your point that if you have more than some number of things that have to be fixed, it's too much, it's too poorly prepared to merit consideration
Right.
by the journal. But if you're inviting a revision and there are things that they don't get fixed, you would still reject them for it. It seems like you need to give the authors that information or you'll get the paper back prized. You'll line the whole. So.
Yeah, that's fair. So that's entirely right. You can't be, by the time you've got to this point, you've got a pretty good idea of what's going on. You've looked at all the figures, you've looked at all the description, you have some notion of what they're saying in the discussion, the introduction's okay. And there are the methods there that with the methods, you've basically got to check that the methods they use are described. That's all you're being asked to do, really. So you don't need to keep going. I mean, once you've got to the point where if you really like it and you really think it's good and that sort of thing, and you've got these points, then you can keep going. But you're doing that because you must have made a decision at that point, right? But you really got to ask yourself the question, if you're going to write more than a page, or I mean, there's some journals but I've had reviews back which have gone on for, longer than their damn paper sometimes. I mean, and why, right? Because it doesn't usually change the momentum of the paper. And if there's that much wrong with it, it really ought to get rejected and they have another go. But I mean, you have a lot of latitude here, but you are titrating the value you bring to the system to help the editor to the value you bring to help the author, right? The value to help the author is incidental to the process of helping the decision, right? And what you need to do to help the editor will help the authors. But your job is not to help rewrite the author's paper, right? Or redesign their experiments. So you put your review in. Typically, the editors collect, 2 or 3 authors' comments. They look at them, and it's either reject, accept, that doesn't happen very often, but it can do, or there's a revision. And if you're a good editor, you'll go through and rewrite partly, or give some guidance to the authors about what's important and what isn't. I mean, if somebody asks for a new mouse to be made or something, I mean, as an editor, I can say, no, you don't need to do that. Because my reasoning is this, is that if the person had made that new mouse, which is like, 18 months work and a whole lot of things, why would they be sending this paper to my journal? They'd send it to a higher impact journal. And of course, I want papers too. So remember, there is the editor wants good quality papers that fit the journal, right? So the editor will sometimes overrule, and should overrule, the reviewer's comments. Because some reviewers write as if they're writing for Nature, right? And it's the impact factor 5 or 6 journal. So it's not appropriate, right? So the revision may come back to you as a reviewer. So this is where the point David made is quite important, actually. So if you've gone into the major revision category, you will now be asked to read what the reviewer has responded. Now this should be a 10-minute decision if the job's done properly. If you've done your job in the first place right, it's a 10-minute decision. But if you, as he says, if you missed out something crucial, it's pretty unfair now to bring it into play, right? So are the responses reasonable and collegial, right? If the person is rude back and argumentative, can't understand why they asked this, it's a stupid experiment, it's quite possible as a reviewer you ask for something which actually doesn't make sense. And as an author, you've got to find a tactful way of saying that back, right? Was every point addressed? So, you know, you should have every point and the response in it. You can only raise new points related to new data. It's very uncollegial and unprofessional to come up with something totally new, which was in the beginning manuscript. Right? You've got to read the other reviews. Did you miss something? So if the other reviewer found something that you totally glossed over, you can say in your comments back to the editors, when I saw the first review, I did not notice this and I agree with reviewer 1. You can also say, I disagree with reviewer 1. I don't think this is the best interpretation. Were you too tough? So this is a great opportunity to calibrate yourself. Were you too tough? Were you too lenient? So the answer to this pretty much should be yes or no. And you should only be writing, the authors have responded appropriately, the authors have not addressed X. So you can't be writing, I like the experiment that they added, it really improved the quality of the paper, and now, you know, why? It's yes or no, right? So in this, it's about you've had your say, and now you have to fit with what you've got. But you can use the other reviewers as a guide. All right. Things to avoid. Great paper should be published. If you send that to any editor, it's useless. They will ignore you because it doesn't say anything. All right? I don't have any confidence you've read it. All right? So I want to say, I mean, you should be able to say that, but you can't. Right? So you should have that 2 or 3 sentence thing and say, then you will read it. If you read it, you'll find something. You can say, expand it. But give some confidence to the editor that you actually read it. Yeah? And if you think it's a great paper, you need to say why you think it's a great paper. So some journals, quite a lot actually, have a little box where they say, explain why you think this paper should be published. Right? And that's your thing. Don't be sarcastic or insulting. Because it's too easy, isn't it? It's anonymous, and you know you don't like it if you get it. It's not necessary, right? And actually it plays against you because I had a review of a paper last year, which one reviewer was, this is an interesting study, this is good science, this is new data, these things have to be addressed. There are about 3 or 4 things which actually needed experiments, right? There was another review which was a rant. I can't believe these authors have taken the time to do this experiment. There's nothing of interest or novelty here. The interpretation of all of this data is, it was pretty rude, right? Insulting. But in fact, there were no experiments, right? It was just a rejection on a rant, right? And that was great for me. Because although I was irritated and upset at the time, right, when I actually wrote the response, in fact, the reviewer who was more collegial was the one I had to actually do some work for. The other one I said, we're disappointed at the uncollegial tone of the author, the reviewer, and we have done our best to respond to what we think their comment is. And to the editor, I said, I don't know how to respond to this. It's just an uncollegial rant, you know. And so, of course, he ignored him. So it doesn't help you, right? Extensive, don't make loads of comments to the editor which are not in the comments to the authors, because then what is the editor supposed to do? You want them to copy and paste what you've done and put it in that. So don't do that. To the author, I mean, I don't even bother commenting to the editors typically. I just say, see review below. Because my feeling is if you're not prepared to say it to the authors, why are you prepared to say it to the editors? The only case where that is true is if you have some ethical problem, duplication of data, falsified data, somebody ripping off somebody else's paper, publishing the same data twice, you need to understand, you need guidance from the editor of how to handle that. It's not usually the case you should put that in your review. That should go from the editor to the authors, and they are then responsible for taking whatever action is taken, right? But don't be writing, it is a disgrace that figure 1 is the same as figure 8 and it's reproduced from a paper from 3 years ago, right? It's not your role to be have a reaction to it. It's your role to report it, right? So you can't ignore those things. Your job is to actually evaluate those things. Because for every paper that comes through with scientific fraud, if you actually look at the examples, they're pretty obvious a lot of the time. And that means that reviewers didn't do, and the editors didn't do their job. Right? So what does a reviewer you want? Do you know who this dude is? Who's that? Saved more people than any other scientist born. Which other scientists saved more people than anybody else ever? Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin, right? Okay. And got the Nobel Prize, right? So when you don't want to be the reviewer who rejected a future Nobel Prizes winner's paper with some sarcastic smart-ass remark, which when they get their Nobel Prize they say, oh, my first paper was rejected by this reviewer. So you need to be completely immune to who the receiving person is. It's part of our job to be collegial and have a bit of humility. So you need to, what do you want the author to think? And I'm putting somebody who's massively famous because you would want Alexander Fleming, who's dead actually, but to have a good opinion of you, right? You want the person to be fair. You want the reviewer to be fair. You want to have the feeling they read your paper. You want to have the feeling that your paper was improved. You want to have the feeling that the person was knowledgeable and engaged in what you're doing and not judgmental about it. And you want to have the feeling it was helpful. And if you do that, even if you give something which is fairly tough, people will appreciate it. I mean, we all have a bit of a rant about it, but, you know, you get over it. And I have never had a process where I had to review a paper where the paper didn't end up better than what I submitted. It always improves it, right? So you're delivering something which people accept and you can have a very, very positive effect. Now, I put myself here not because I'm very famous or anything, but because I couldn't find a picture of an editor which I could use. So as an editor, what do I want? I want a fair, balanced, and rapid response. I really don't care if you write a lot. I mean, half a page is going to be enough for you to get across to me your feelings or decisions about that paper. I want to have the confidence you read the paper. I want a clear opinion to support the recommendation. And I want your recommendation to match your opinion. Rejection. Figure 2 legend should be extended. Well, hang on a minute. Why is this a rejection, right? Okay. 12 comments. The paper should be accepted with minor revision. Well, that's absolutely impossible. You know, if you have 12 comments, it can't possibly be a minor revision. And I see all these sorts of inconsistencies, right? Clear review for the authors to respond to. I mean, the format of it is so easy. 2-3 sentences at the top, minor points, major points, minor points, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And trust me, when you get the paper back as a reviewer to evaluate the revision, you are going to like the fact it says 1, 2, 3, 4, and is not a stream of consciousness, right? Okay? And I want to be in the situation I thought, oh, that was good, I'll use them again. Now, you may think the last thing I want is another paper to review, but actually it builds your reputation in a very strong way. And that's how you get onto an editorial board. That's how you get to be an editor-in-chief. So if you want to be on an editorial board or an editor-in-chief or start your own journal or any of those sort of things, you've got to serve in the trenches. You've got to be a reviewer. You've got to be an author. Don't expect to be a member of an editorial board if you've never published in that journal. Don't expect to be a member of an editorial board if you haven't published any papers. Don't expect to be a member of the editorial board if you take 6 weeks to do a review. Because when I look at that, I have a big chart from Elsevier with everybody's name on it, and it says number of days taken to decision, number declined, right? And so there's all this data there. So you are leaving an imprint on the scientific community, like it or not, right?
Is data shared across journals?
Not a lot, no, rarely. But it's a small world, so, you know, very quickly you can be in a situation and you say, oh, we should use so-and-so as a reviewer. Oh no, I was on another journal with him, he was terrible, he was very slow. You know, so your reputation gets built on how you behave in this. And that's fair, I think. And that's it. So it's a process which you, if you want to, you can let it consume you. You can accept every paper. Okay, so if you do a good job and you get it back and you do it, you will get another paper to review. Okay, that's guaranteed, right? So you want but you have control over that. You can titrate that. So it's a process which can consume you. It can take every waking moment you have if you let it. So you've got to balance it with all the other things you're doing. And you can reach a effective contribution, do an effective job and a fair job most of the time in under an hour. And do the experiment. I mean, get yourself set up, have your paper ready, and set the timer and have the goal in doing it in an hour and see if you can do it. And I think you'll find there's no difference. A lot of the time I talk to a lot of people about time management, and one of the big defects or big mistakes that people make, senior and junior academics, is not defining a specific time period in order to achieve a task and just leaving it open-ended. So that includes grants and writing papers. So don't say, I'm going to write a paper this month. You say, I'm going to write the 3 figures and results section in the next 2 days. So time management is very important. And what I'm saying to you is you can make a more effective contribution to the scientific community and a fair one by following some of the ideas or using some of the ideas I've talked to you about.
One of the things is consumer time while reviewing. When they write something in the intro or discussion like this, no much body evidence about the interaction between this and this or something. But if you read something about it before, so I go and dig about it, and you mentioned not to about it.
What?
So what's your insights or vision about what they write about? So really.
Well, you should have done right at the beginning a basic research about that. And you should have some notion from your own experience. That's why you're being asked, right? So you've got some idea already. Most papers don't get rejected or accepted based on what's written in the introduction. So focus on the experiments. If the experiments all look solid and all look good, then yeah, it's appropriate to do that. But you're not there to judge whether that statement was fair or not fair, because then you have to do this massive evaluation of the literature, right? Which you're not being asked to do. That's not part of what you're being asked to do. Well, either you know, if you know that because you know that literature and you have a different opinion of that, it's quite fair to say it. But I wouldn't recommend, as part of the reviewing process, you take the 4 or 5 hours it's going to take to get to a position where you can make that judgment. You've got an editor who knows about the field. You've got 2 or 3 other reviewers. And if you feel nervous about that point, right, you can say to the editor in the editor's comments, the authors make these statements about this. This is not my area of expertise, but please make some evaluation about I suggest you get somebody with a deeper knowledge of the field to make that judgment. You know, so if you do that, you've just turned a 1-hour project into a 3-day project, right? And it's tricky because the literature is so massive these days, you're never really confident that you've got every paper that, you know.
Question about the very first part, the type to accept or decline to review a paper. As a junior person, I was always told that I should pretty much just accept them. I didn't really have much of an excuse to not review them unless there's really a conflict or it's not my field. That's true?
No, I mean, it's nonsense. So, I mean, it makes no sense, does it, right? So the people who, no, it makes no sense. The people who are telling you that are people in my generation, probably. And the reason is that when we grew up, as it were, in your situation, the number of journals was very, very small. I mean, when I was, you know, when I started here, you know, 20 years ago or so. And I've been doing research for, I don't know, 30, 40 years. When I did my postdoc, every single paper on cytochrome oxidase, all 35 of them, is in one box, okay? And they were either in biochemistry, Journal of Biological Chemistry, or the Biochemical Journal. That was it. I mean, really, that was it. So that's a different era where now there are hundreds of journals, you know? So you've got to be selective because the demand on the system, I mean, in that era, China was not contributing to the scientific community in any meaningful way at all. It was cut off. India communicating. Now China's one of the top research countries in the world, contributing a lot. Just China on its own has added a massive amount to that system. So now you have to be selective, and I will warn all of you, there are some, unfortunately, in the last 5 years, there are now predatory journals, right? And what they're doing is they're ripping people off by accepting money to publish their papers and just taking the money. There's no peer review. But to make it look authentic, they get a few people to be on an editorial board, and they get a few reviewers, and they're being used. And so don't agree to review a paper in a journal which is not from a reputable pub. Yeah. Yeah, so you see the rule that people, and I, to be perfectly honest to you too, I would have said things like that too. You know, yeah, you got, but it's not true anymore. You need to be selective. So what's your field? Yeah, so if you're in genetics and epigenetics and I don't know what your major, you know, molecular biology journal or something, which you know, yeah, you should absolutely say yes to that. If it's some journal with impact factor lower than 2 or 3, why are you bothering? Right? Yeah, so it's changed.
Sometimes as junior in this field, we usually from this kind of
Yeah.
How do we get involved in those higher 6 or 7 MITs like PI or higher than our field? How could we get involved?
Well, learn your trade, learn your skills. So if you're doing, American Journal of Physiology is an extremely good journal and has a very nice interface for reviewers and editors. So that is a great place to learn your trade. And you start doing a good job in that and get the confidence in that and the experience in that, your name will get around and your reputation will grow. And then when in the meetings, you can talk to the editor and say, I'm junior faculty, I work on this, I've reviewed for AJP 20 papers, and then they'll say, okay, I would like to review for you if you find anything of alternative, anything appropriate. But you've got to learn your trade. I mean, if you can't nail this review process, so it's a routine thing in your brain, so you can't go into it treating every paper as unique. You've got to have a little bit of a template in your head about how you're going to do it and knock it off, right? If you're not in a place to do that, don't go around making promises to other people to do it. Otherwise, you're going to get in a mess, You've got to be able to deliver.
Well, recently there has been some discussion about peer reviews and so on, and other concepts have been proposed, double blind or open reviews or public reviews. You think of all of it. So recently, at least in the journals that I review, they don't enforce it, but they give you at least a choice as a reviewer, clear your name, so the authors see it. Sometimes even Nature now,
right?
The authors have a choice to publish their reviews with the paper with your name. Do you think that's a good idea? Should we take advantage? I did it one time. Let's see how it goes.
I would, in principle, it sounds all right, right? Yeah, but in practice, I would find it very, very hard to be objective and critical of somebody I know well. And people's reactions are not in your control. So our behaviors are not, either everybody has to do it and every journal has to do it, but then I think it's the same as writing references, for jobs and things. If you, in the United States, it's very difficult to get an honest reference out of anybody because people fear the retaliation, right? I don't think we're mature enough as a community to not retaliate. I really don't. I mean, I see people, I'm an editor, right? I see people blaming other people for rejecting their papers and stuff, when actually I know it's absolutely not true because I know who the reviewer was, right? So scientists and researchers and clinicians, we're all human and we all have a tendency to retaliate. So should the institution be blinded? There's a lot of trust that goes into writing a paper. So if I get a paper from any any developing country or developed country, and I have a confidence they have an established academic system, then I have some confidence that IACUC, IRB, ethics and all those things are ingrained into the culture. Because there is not enough information in a scientific research paper to judge those things. So if somebody says this study was done with the approval of the University of Alabama, animal care thing or whatever the phrase is you have to write, I have 100% confidence that is true because I know it is impossible to do an animal experiment here without IACUC approval. So there's a lot of trust that goes into those things. So I don't think blinding the place or helps either, but I don't think we're mature enough as a community to handle that. Oh, there's some interesting models, by the way. though, where there are some very interesting models where you actually put your data out and then you interpret it as a community, right? So people then give all their responses and interpretations of your data and anything. That's pretty cool, right? But again, we're not mature enough. This university runs a Harvard-style promotion and tenure, which means your credit will depend not on that process, but on your individual performance. How many papers did you publish as a senior author or a first author? We are not interested in community-based. We have no way of evaluating that. So you've got to be careful of that, you know.
Advice on efficient review process, because that seems to, for me at least, really lengthen the time it takes to review.
Hey, that's a great question. You know, I love to do that. I don't do it all of the time, but if I've got a graduate student who is working on exactly the same sort of thing, I will ask them to do it, but then I'll get them to do it. I'll give them some guidance. Then I'll do it. Sometimes I do it independently, and I'll say, okay, let's see what we both wrote. Sometimes I'll then take what they did and do it. So that, of course, if you bring in the training thing into it, that's a completely different thing, and then all of this goes out the window, right? I mean, because your goal is different, right? And that will take a lot more time. But yeah, that's a great thing to do. I mean, I wouldn't do it for every paper. What you should not do, because it's unethical, is give the paper to your postdoc or somebody to do and then put it in as yours. That's right. Well, I'm just saying, there is a lot of that happening, and I can tell when it happens, right? But there's nothing wrong with working with them to do that. I mean, yeah, Tanisha and I used to work with them. We did that quite a few times, didn't we, right? Yeah.
So as an editor, there is sometimes we discuss how the optimal review process happens, right? It's either a clear reject, it's either major revision. What happens if or how do you decide if you have a conflict between reviewers? I mean, I see crazy things, you know, one accepts, other one rejects, and then it ends up in a cycle. Sometimes another reviewer is asked to participate, and then you have a review process of a year or something like that.
Well, as an editor, I review it myself then, because that's part of my job, you know. And those things can be legitimate, or those things can be a combination of either, you know. So I just started a journal in 2011, and the policy of the journal is there is no major revision. So either it's accepted with minor changes or not. And the logic is this, is that there are no major revisions. We don't allow that category. And the reasoning is this, is there are lots of circumstances where you have a solid piece of data with a properly done, which makes a straightforward point, and there is no forum for that, right? And science is about momentum. There are plenty of journals which have very thorough, complex, long-winded reviewing processes, but that, you know, so this is a bit different. We say, okay, we take a bit more of a risk. There is no major revision, but if you've got a piece of study which makes sense and is internally consistent, then it should go out and see what the world thinks about it, you know. All right, any other questions? Well, thank you. Hopefully you found that helpful.